So yesterday we focused on the broader issues of school reform, and we got a great history from Dick Deasy, and then we got a sense of counterpoint with a superintendent and a music advocate about school reform, and then you had a great opportunity, and I had a chance to walk into each of your discussion sessions, so I know there's a lot of opportunity. I also heard from a few of you that we didn't have enough time to discuss, which really encourages me because this afternoon we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss a lot. But what we're doing today is we're moving to sort of a side part, but for us at least, a very important part of school reform, which means the partnership between professional certified music teachers in the schools and outside organizations that can bring a lot to the table. We got a hint from that about that last night with the performance of our formerly declassified and now Dakota group, and I mean they were stupendous. But they laid out for us, I think, in the pre-concert talk and also the way they presented themselves about the kinds of things that we can expect with partnerships and the openness that generation of, for example, chamber music groups are about working with schools. And so that gives you a hint of what we're going to talk about today, okay? We start with an overview, and then we'll move into two specific examples, New Haven and Atlanta, in the next session. But our first session will be led by I want to avoid the fact that this whole symposium is all about me, right? But yesterday I mentioned when I introduced Scott Schuler, I said the thing we had most in common is that we're both recent grandparents, right? And so we're friends, and so as we watch that. But I want to introduce now David Meyers, whose distinguished biography is in your packet. But I, of course, want to connect it to the fact that my son just did all his doctoral studies in his ABD at the University of Minnesota. So, but David and I have known each other a long time before that, and he is really the cat's meow as far as how partnerships develop. And I'm just so pleased that he's joining us today. So let me now introduce David Meyers from the University of Minnesota.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you for that warm welcome. What Michael didn't mention is that his son Nathaniel has just won the audition among 140 candidates for a cello seat in the North Carolina Symphony. So we will lay claim to that from Minnesota. Although, of course, we know it took a lot of years for Nathaniel to get to that point. But I know Michael's very, very proud, as are we. I also want to say congratulations to all of you on this very distinguished honor of being part of this symposium, having been invited here. Congratulations on the work that you do day to day in making sure that the children in our schools have a balanced and comprehensive education. What I want to talk a little bit about today is the fact that I don't think we can do it alone. A lot of us work very hard in our own situations. When I taught middle school for 10 years, I had one band of about 100 kids, another band of 120 kids, a jazz band of about 30 kids because it was y'all come. It was not a big band. It was anybody who wanted to learn about jazz. That met after school. Before school, we also had rehearsals. I had an orchestra, and I taught 1,200 general music kids a week. So I know something about what it means to be in the trenches, and I know something about the level of commitment that all of you show day by day in the work that you do. So I thank you for that. I congratulate you for that. I am going to challenge all of us a little bit today, including myself, as a member of the traditional music education community, because I firmly believe that the future of music in life and learning, not only for children, but for all people, requires a collaborative vision and collaborative effort among all those who share a sense of importance about the value of music and humanity. You know, what we talk about here is anthropologically documented as having been part of every civilization since the beginning of time. You can't say that about math. You can't say that about spoken or written language. But you can say that about music. Warren Benson, wonderful composer who actually was a composer in the schools under the Young Composers Project back in the early 60s, along with Emmylou Deemer and Peter Schickele of PDQ Bach fame, and some other very significant composers. Warren Benson said, yes, it's true that the first thing that people were concerned about was shelter and clothing. But once they had a roof over their heads to protect them from the elements, and once they had some kind of modest coverage of their bodies, the first thing they did was to decorate, was to provide some aesthetic ambiance to their lives. And they immediately began using pitch and rhythm and form and texture and design as ways of communicating with one another. So we are not talking about something secondary or subsidiary. We are talking about something primary in life from its very beginnings. And so I want to challenge us to think about the fact that there are others who share that kind of belief about music, and that by working together, we have an opportunity to create a lasting place for music, not only in our schools, but also for opportunities for music participation and learning throughout life. Who was Sisyphus? Anybody? Well, Sisyphus was that Greek guy who made Zeus very angry by playing a trick on him. And so his punishment was that he had to keep rolling a rock up the hill over and over and over. Every time he got to the top of the hill, the rock would come down to the bottom. Einstein has said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting something to change. How long has the current structure for music education in our schools been in existence? And for how many decades have we been trying to convince policymakers that the way we do it is an assurance of creativity, innovation, multiple answers and outcomes, and yet we've not been successful? What about Sisyphus? Well, maybe if he had had a couple of collaborators, he might have actually gotten that rock up to the top of the hill. Virtually no one disagrees that music and the arts are important. There have been survey after survey after survey. Is music important? Yes. Is music important in our schools? Yes. Is music as important as every other subject? Not sure. Kids, what's your favorite subject in school? And too many surveys have shown that music comes out very low. That's a sad commentary. It's not an indictment of what we do, but it does raise questions that we need to confront. We have to question assumptions, like all kids get music up until age 10 or 11, fewer get it from age 11 to 13, and fewer than 20% get it from 14 through graduation. Can we claim a core status in the schools when at the high school level we serve fewer than 20% of the population? In the dark ages when I taught in middle school, general music was required for every student in that school system through 10th grade. Why did it disappear in 9th and 10th grade? Not because the policymakers came around and said you can't do this anymore. Not because the school principal or superintendent said this isn't important. Not because the parents said we're not willing to pay for music teachers for general music. But because the music teachers only wanted to teach performance. They did not want to teach the other 80%. We must become disruptive innovators. We must think in new ways. We must create and interrogate multiple models of music education in our schools. We must collaborate with all those who share a vision for the importance of music in life and learning. We must take some risks, and we must stop believing that extra musical justifications will convince policymakers, parents, and others about our value. I'm not suggesting that music doesn't have a relationship to math or language arts or social studies. In fact, I completely endorse and embrace the integrative curriculum. But it is not a justification for music. It is an indicator that music, along with all of those subjects, plays a very important role in who we are as human beings. If we expect to build a consensus around the place of music in schools and in life, we have to be change agents. We have to model the values, the creativity, those multiple answers to problems, the critical thinking and the innovation that we argue are the outcomes of experiences in the arts. If we as artists cannot be more innovative than we currently are in a rapidly changing, technological, global, diverse society, we cannot expect superintendents, boards of education, and policymakers at the state and federal levels to believe that the arts make a difference. So why do we have schools, and why do we have school music? I'd like you to find 2 or 3 people around you very, very quickly. First things that come into your mind, but 2 rules. 1, no educationese. And 2, you may not use the word prepare or preparation. Okay? 2 minutes. Why schools? Why school music? Okay, obviously this is a conversation that hopefully could go on for a very long time. But let's hear from about 3 people as to something that came up. Why schools? Why school music? Remember, you have to take risks, so don't be afraid. Let's hear from somebody. Yes, thank you.
We teach them appreciation for beauty.
Appreciation for beauty. When was the last time in talking about standards and talking about advocacy that you heard the word beauty? The beautiful in music. Gee, you can't measure that. Okay, what else did you talk about? Yes?
We talked about 2 different things. First of all, passion and something to have passion for, something to be passionate about, some way to channel that passion. And then we also talked about a common bond, a common language that everyone, no matter their socioeconomic
Later on, we're going to talk about music as a universal means of expression and communication. Yeah. And it's not the same thing as music as a universal language, by the way, because music means vastly different things in vastly different cultures. One more.
Nurtures self-discipline and dignity.
All right. All good answers, and thank you for not saying, we prepare students to be successful in their careers. Yes, that's important, but it's not the most important thing that we do, because without the kinds of values that come from the arts, people will not be ultimately successful in their careers or in their interactions in society. Well, Elliot Eisner, a name that I hope you're familiar with, said the point of learning something in school is to enrich life outside of school and to acquire the skills and ideas that will enable one to produce the questions and perform the activities that one's outside life will require. The question, how does music education relate to what Eisner suggests one's life requires? We hear a lot about the relationship between school music and what goes on beyond the schoolroom walls, just as we do with Eisner. One of my doctoral students, Melissa Arasi, was interested in high school choral programs and what graduates 10 years out would say about the influence of high school choral programs on their musical lives, first of all, and secondly, on their lives in general. She flew all over the country interviewing students who had been part of a widely heralded high school choral program. What the students remembered about the program was the wonderful trips they took. They made no relationship between that program and their current musical lives. Another one of my doctoral students, Todd Sneed, did a case study of a high school in Atlanta. And he went to kids in the community as they were active in music, and he also followed them around during the school day. And his dissertation is entitled Dichotomous Musical Worlds, because kids said, this is really what we do in music. And if you want to do school music, then you join the band or the chorus. That's what they do in school. In the real world of music, what we do is we get together and we have garage bands. We sing in our church choirs. We do a whole host of things that you don't do in school. But school music is okay. School music is good, but it really doesn't have anything to do with our musical lives beyond school. This is not new. Back in 1941, Dichotomous Garkin said, "We are concerned with the question as to whether high school music cannot be so conducted that it will be practiced after graduation much more than it is at present. What effect upon high school music teaching would the establishing of greater community relationships have?" 1941, they were concerned that kids were putting their instruments away and not continuing to play after high school. So now with your little group, or if you didn't particularly like the people you were connecting with, you can find somebody else. But with a little group around you, pick either question 1, how does music education relate to what Eisner suggests one life requires? Question 2, is this question relevant to school reform? Question 3, what does the practice of music after graduation mean in today's world? 3 minutes, and we'll report out. We'll just choose a few folks again to report out. About 3 minutes this time. Just pick any one of the 3 questions. Doesn't matter which one you pick, okay? Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I hope these are questions that you might continue to ponder. Did any groups deal with question number 1, what our life outside requires? Anybody take that one? All right, well, we'll get back to that one as a group. Oh, you did? Oh, wonderful, thank you. Yeah.
We were just talking about how studying music prepares you for life, and not necessarily in the content at stage, but it's talking specifically about our band, how just learning time management, self-discipline, perseverance, recognizing beauty. We started talking quite a bit about that, how easy it is to recognize beauty in a rehearsal setting, and I started talking about how that applies to different parts of our lives. Like, I don't watch figure skating, I don't watch gymnastics, but I can tell when something is quality, when something is excellent. I can usually tell who the gold medalist is going to be. I couldn't tell you why, but it's just a recognition of something quality, something excellent that we can apply to any other part of our lives.
Excellent. Throughout our lives, we're going to make judgments, aren't we? And one of the things that we do in music, obviously, is critical thinking if we engage the kids in critical thinking. And here's a very important point. If our method of teaching is to stand on the podium and be an error detector and corrector, then students do not develop critical thinking skills. But if we say to our kids, what did you hear? How could we make it better? Let's try Johnny's way. Let's try Martha's way. Which one seems to be more beautiful? Which one seems to work better? That's the kind of critical thinking we'll have to do throughout our lives. And boy, we could sure use a lot of it today. Okay, how about question number 2? Is this question relevant? Some people say it's not, because school music is meant to be the inculcation of music literacy, and what you do outside is the application of that literacy. Anybody take on question number 2? Yes.
I was just struck by the study you shared where she went out and asked, what do you remember from your high school program? And they said the trips. And I was struck by that. And I was thinking, what would my students who I had as high school students, what would they say? And they would also say, oh, we had such a beautiful community. And you were like my mom, and we were a family. And we do such an awesome job in our ensembles of creating a safe place and having these magical moments. But then I realized that no, they're going to say that. They're going to say that it was like this, and we experienced that there, and wasn't that wonderful? And that I haven't done anything to show them how they can take that and give them the skills to take that forward into their future and into their future musical life. So thank you. Yes, absolutely, this is relevant for school.
Yeah, it's about consciousness, isn't it? Yeah, we do all these great things in our classrooms, but we think that somehow kids automatically make the transfer. It's about our consciousness about helping kids think about what are the potentials and possibilities for me throughout life. Where are the community choirs that I can join? If I don't join a community choir, where are the options for me to pursue music in my community? Kids, I'm just giving you the very beginning here. You've got a lifetime to explore all of this rich opportunity to have a musical life and to have music in your life. And my job is to make sure that you go out of here with the capacity to do that. Musical self-confidence, musical independence, so you're not dependent on me waving my arms all the time in front of the group. The ability to generate on your own musical opportunities. Did anybody take number 3? Yes, sir.
We talked about the notion that we hope when we teach music in the schools that it becomes a vocation for very few, an avocation for many more, and a deep appreciation for all. And we talked about the fact that while probably less than half the kids that graduate high school still playing an instrument continue with instrumental, we said probably more continue with vocal and find community choirs than find community bands or orchestras. But even those who don't continue in any way with an instrument in their hands, they're the ones that you see at the concerts we go, and they're also the ones who make sure their kids start music when they're of the age to do it.
Yeah. Here's that other 80% factor, right? What are those 80% who have not had the opportunity to pursue music in school going to do when the referendum comes about whether we're going to increase our taxes to support music programs? But the 20% who participate are likely to do that. How can we extend that positive value around music beyond those 20% that we service right now? Well, Alan Britton, who was Dean of the School of Music at the University of Michigan, said in 1961, 20 years later than Gherkins and Dichotomous, music education, although created and nurtured by a popular love of music, remember music education in schools really grew out of the singing school movement. Although created and nurtured by a popular love of music, has nevertheless always operated at a certain distance from the well springs of American musical life, both popular and artistic. Exactly what Todd Sneed's, I hate to say subjects, I don't like referring to them that way, but the students who participated in Todd Sneed's study were still telling him the same thing. Well, what about school reform and music and arts education? I think you heard some of this yesterday, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But Sputnik, of course, is the place where we mark the current age of education reform, the sudden awareness that we were falling behind the Soviets, and so on and so forth. And so there was a conference called at the Woods Hole, what is that, scientific, off of Cape Cod, at Woods Hole, to discuss what we were going to do about education in this country. And one of the participants there was a Harvard psychologist by the name of Jerome Bruner, who wrote The Process of Education, coming off of the Woods Hole Conference. And here's what he had to say. In the past half century, the scholars at the forefront of their disciplines, those who might be able to make the greatest contribution to the substantive reorganization of their fields, were not involved in the development of curricula for the elementary and secondary schools. In consequence, school programs have often dealt inadequately or incorrectly with contemporary knowledge. Now, this is not to say that teachers don't do a great job. This is to say that teachers can't be and know everything. And so we have to think about other expertise in our field, other individuals, other organizations who can bring important elements to bear on the work that we do. So the idea, for example, of artists in schools, which we're going to talk about here very quickly, was extended to the sciences and the humanities in the 1960s. Scholars from universities were coming into public schools and collaborating with the teachers in those schools to try to increase the rigor of the content. So in the 1960s, we have two threads, and these threads have not always been compatible. In fact, there's been a lot of tension between these two threads along the way. You may or may not have experienced this or been aware of it. There's what was happening in education and music and arts education on the one hand, and then there's what was coming out of what I call the arts policy complex, which is the NEA, the state arts councils, the philanthropic foundations such as the Rockefeller Foundation, and so on. Government policymakers and foundations were going one direction, while music and arts educator organizations were going another direction, even though there were some commonalities across the two. So I'm not going to go into detail on each of these. I hope that some of them are familiar to you. The Young Composers Project, which I mentioned a minute ago, which placed composers in schools and became part of the Contemporary Music Project, trying to give kids more experience with contemporary music through living, breathing composers. As someone said, I think yesterday, not dead white men, but rather contemporary composers, male and female. The Yale Seminar held right here, but there were no music educators at the Yale Seminar. There were music critics, there were music scholars, there were practicing performing musicians, but they said we need to up the level of content and practice, and we need to expand the repertoire. We need to include music that is not part of the Western classical canon. The Tanglewood Symposium a few years later, which was specifically a music education symposium on music and society. We moved towards the conceptual curriculum away from the information-based curriculum. In music, concepts are things like pitches in music may rise and fall. Phrases in music may repeat or contrast. We moved towards the conceptual curriculum. Expert professionals began contributing to curriculum content, and we had the open classrooms, discovery learning, heterogeneous groupings, and so on. On the other side, the arts policy complex, we had the Arts and Humanities program under the U.S. Office of Education. We had the first ESOL funding, Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, and there's a new one of those now coming along that's impacting education reform. We had the formation of the National Endowment for the Arts, and we had the first Artists in Schools program out of the federal government, which was the Poets in Schools program. It was very clear at the time that poets were there to supplement the work of English teachers, not to take the place of English teachers, but to supplement the work of English teachers. Then something happened. Some of you may remember, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember, the oil crisis in the 1970s, along with a lot of criticism of open classrooms. Things were too soft in the 60s, too kind of touchy-feely, and so on and so forth. No, we need behavioral objectives. Scott referred to this yesterday, gave a beautiful example of what happens if 95% of the notes are correct. But we were saying ridiculous things like 80% of the students will perform with 95% accuracy 10% of the time. I don't know. It's just absolutely ridiculous, okay? But there we were. It was the first age of accountability. We had the economic crisis, which meant that music teachers were being pink-slipped, particularly in large metropolitan areas like New York and Chicago. We had the rise of a publication called the School Music Program Description and Standards. On the other side, in the arts policy complex, we had the demise of the Arts and Humanities program, more dollars going into Artists in Schools programs. The Artists in Schools programs began to be the primary program in education from the National Endowment for the Arts and state arts councils. I personally thought this was fantastic. I finished my master's degree in 1973. I was a music therapist before that. I moved into public school teaching. And in 1978, I applied to the National Endowment for the Arts to host a composer in residence in my middle school in Pennsylvania. At that time, you could get a composer in residence for an entire year. I was very fortunate to get the grant and to have a composer in residence who worked with all those 1,200 kids in the school on the creative process, wrote music for our ensembles, and brought in well-known composers such as Václav Nelibel and other performers as well to work with our students. It was an incredibly exciting year. But I learned a very important lesson about artists in schools. I had said to the kids, now, we're getting this composer coming to the school, and in those days, I had to wear a white shirt and a necktie to teach. And I said, now, this guy is an artist, and so he probably won't be wearing a white shirt and a necktie. He might even come to school in jeans. He's likely to be very kind of casual. He's not here as a teacher. He's here as a composer. Well, he arrived in a three-piece knit suit that made my shirt and tie look like something out of the rag bag. And one day, a little seventh grader raised his hand and he said, Mr. X, how do you figure out which instruments to put on the parts when you write a piece? And I'm sitting in the back of the room going, yes. And Mr. X says, well, when you get to college, you take a course called orchestration, and that teaches you how to do that. Now, so much for my notion of artistry. Now, this is not to say that we had a bad experience with the composer. We had a very positive experience with the composer. But part of it was that I learned that I had to take the lead with what my students needed. I was the educator. He was the composer. His role was to be a composer, not to become the de facto teacher. And this is something that sometimes gets mixed up when we begin bringing non-education professionals into our schools, as valuable as they are. There was a report came out in the 70s called Coming to Our Senses, and that report also focused heavily on partnerships and visiting artists in schools. And there was an evaluation to find out whether having artists in schools improved arts education. There was really no evidence to show that it necessarily improved arts education per se. But what it did indicate was that arts teachers felt that they had fellow colleagues working with them in trying to deliver the highest level curriculum they could possibly deliver. So, are they supplements? Yes, they should be supplements. Are they there primarily to serve artists and arts organizations? No, they have to be in the schools to serve the students. Are we talking about education in the arts or through the arts? Yes, we're talking about both. And are we talking about instrumental outcomes, non-musical outcomes, or only musical outcomes? The answer is both. Both are important. In the 80s, A Nation at Risk, in 1983, our schools were in a rising tide of mediocrity. More emphasis on public-private partnerships. Partnerships were springing up everywhere. Everybody wanted to have a partnership with the school. Buy t-shirts with the local company's name on it for all the kids. Partnership after partnership after partnership, some of them worthwhile, many of them not. And so we began to have questions as to the purpose and value of partnerships. Some of you will remember E.D. Hirsch's book, Cultural Literacy, in which he defined very clearly what every student should know and be able to do, including in music. If you never read that, go back and read it. It's quite enlightening. On the arts policy complex side, more and more publications about arts education, meetings between the arts educator organizations, such as now NAFME and the NEA, more partnerships. Texaco, Annenberg, NEA were funding, and the funding required partnerships. So if an orchestra wanted funding, they had to establish a partnership with schools. If a museum wanted funding, they had to establish a partnership with schools. Increased use of terms such as sequential and comprehensive in our curriculum, and research evidence that partnerships work best when arts programs in schools are already strong. But they don't necessarily lead to better programs if you don't already have a strong program. The 1990s, of course, Goals 2000, the national standards. The arts education standards were the first to come out. And then we had the performance and assessment standards and various state standards. On the arts complex side, privately funded reports on arts education, Champions of Change, critical, what was that one called? Critical Links or something like that. Anyway, a whole raft of reports. Dialogue with traditional arts education enterprise. There had been a lot of dissension between the government and foundation side and the arts educator side. They began to dialogue with each other, beginning to believe finally that if we work together, we're stronger than if we fight each other. Artists, arts organizations, and arts educators began to be seen as a team of individuals and a team of partners who could impact arts education in the schools. Take a look at this list for a minute. Actually, I need to go back. I missed the 2000s, didn't I? Okay, so in the 2000s, that famous No Child Left Behind, or Every Child Left Behind, as some people say. Goals 2000 was defunded. We moved towards high-stakes testing, adequate yearly progress objectives, an emphasis on STEM, scientifically based research, which essentially means control groups and quantitative research. How difficult for us in the arts, where everything we do is qualitative. This notion that qualitative research is not valid is very, very troubling for those of us in the arts and humanities. Advocacy became a high priority. We lost programs and positions, and we had a few new models to engage a wider range of students in the schools. On the policy complex side, advocacy became a huge priority. But there was a question that we never stopped to ask ourselves. And that question was, and is, what are we advocating for? Because if we're advocating only for what exists, we have too much evidence to show that we are not yet ready to be a core subject. Are we advocating for music for every kid? Or are we only advocating for the talented few, particularly at the secondary level? More research on the value of arts education. Partnership value was assumed, but not necessarily verified through research. A bigger emphasis on art making, the importance of arts education as it relates to lifelong participation, several RAND reports that began talking about the importance of close interaction between artists and students, practicing artists and students, and an NEA study that had been done repeatedly showing that since the early 1980s there's been a significant decline in adult participation in terms of attending arts events. You have to be very careful here. We can't say there's a decline in arts participation. The nature of arts participation has changed. The fact that fewer people go to concerts does not mean people are not participating in the arts. And that's a point that often gets missed in interpreting that research. Now, take a look at these. Where have you heard these things before? In what connection? Right? The 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Sisyphus. Rolling that rock up that hill over and over and over. And yet we seem to face the same problems we faced during all those decades. So what are the perennial themes in music education? And how do you think those themes will be manifest in a 21st century vision for music education? What would you say is perennial and universal about music education? Try to divorce yourself now from the way music education traditionally looks. Be willing to take a risk. What if we threw out the idea of conducted ensembles? I'm not suggesting we do it, but what if we did it? Are ensembles, conducted ensembles, a perennial theme? Or are they a manifestation of a theme that developed at an earlier point in time and continues? This is a little tough, but I'm going to ask you to take 3 minutes and think of one perennial theme in music education. No matter what a program looks like, this always will have to be there. And what will it look like in a 21st century vision for music education? 3 minutes. Yeah, I think I started about 4 minutes. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move along, and we won't report out on this particular one. But again, I hope that this is a question that you will continue to ponder and think about, perhaps with your colleagues at home. What is lasting about music education, and what might it look like if we thought differently from the way we currently think? Here are some thoughts about transforming school music if we put it in a lifespan perspective. Would we challenge the pyramidal paradigm? Fewer kids as we move into the high school years. How relevant are conducted ensembles to lifelong engagement and learning, or how do we ensure that they're relevant? How do we nurture personal music making and creating? How do we bridge school community learning and participation? How do we build learning communities of students, educators, and expert artists? How do we foster intergenerational learning? Part of our problem is that we have a whole generation of parents who didn't have music in their schools. How do we make improvisation and composition core components of music learning? How do we base learning on the authentic structure of musical understanding? Those concepts. Pitches rise and fall is a concept that every musician at every level deals with on a continuing basis. How do we base learning on that kind of authentic content? Assuring music learning for 100% of students in schools at all levels. Why do we need a collaborative vision? Artists, educators, and arts organizations all share the importance of personal and social values of music and the other arts. We have a rich intersection of diverse musics in our society. We should be moving way beyond the traditional Western classical canon, and I think many of us already have, but we need to continue to do it. And you only need to look at somebody like Yo-Yo Ma to understand that this is what real-world artists are doing. Music is central in being human, even in the context of changing demographics. We need to create a sense of value that goes beyond entertainment. We need to think about the potential impact of declining audiences for live classical music. That's a concern that's shared by symphony orchestras, opera companies, chamber groups, and music educators. Musicians need to be creative and entrepreneurial about their career development. The group that you saw last night is one such group. They're having to create their careers. The careers are not ready-made for them. Career musicians can be leaders for opportunity and access alongside music educators. And we need collaborative models that arise organically from within our communities. Collaborative programs in New Haven will not necessarily look like collaborative programs in Minneapolis. Collaborative programs in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania will not necessarily look like collaborative programs in Chicago. We have to beware the cookie-cutter models that say to us, this is the panacea, we'll all do it this way. Collaboration means that we come together around problem solving in our communities, around our needs and our unique capacities and resources. So here's a collaborative vision that I've suggested for all of us who care about the values of music in society. Nurturing universal engagement with the personal and social values of high-quality music learning and participation in a global society. Now, we won't take time to deconstruct that right now, but if we did, we would want to take a look at the key words: universal, engagement, personal, social, high quality, global. That's a vision that I believe everybody who cares about music in life and learning could probably sign on to. There's probably a better way to word it. That just happens to be my version. Why would we embrace it? What would it look like? How would we do it? Who would be responsible? Where would it happen? These are the questions I do not hear being asked in all of the discussions about arts in schools and the value of music for kids and adults. This talks about universal engagement. Our job is not simply to teach school kids, it's to make music learning and participation available across the lifespan. My friend Sean Gregory, who teaches at the Guildhall School in London, says, arts and educational organizations are in a position to become cultural catalysts, encouraging learning environments that offer the widest possible access to participation without compromising reputations and aspirations for excellence. Sir Herbert Reed, an aesthetic philosopher, said the aim of education ought to be conceived of as the preparation of artists, that is, individuals who have developed the ideas, the sensibilities, the skills, and the imagination to create work that is well proportioned, skillfully executed, and imaginative, regardless of the domain in which an individual works. The highest accolade we can confer upon someone is to say that he or she is an artist. I think it goes back to what this group right down here was saying a little bit ago. Elliot Eisner says we need to be able not only to envision fresh options, we need to have feel. Just like beauty. When was the last time you heard somebody talk about the importance of feel? Why are people warring with each other? Because they lack empathy and the ability to feel. Eisner says we have to have feel for the situations in which they appear. In a word, the forms of thinking the arts stimulate and develop are far more appropriate for the real world we live in than the tidy, right-angled boxes we employ in our schools in the name of school improvement. If you can't measure it, you can't say you're improving anything. Do we really want to limit our kids to that kind of boxed-in education? We offer the alternative. Arts organizations are thinking about the same kinds of things arts educators are. This is a model for audience engagement and audience involvement that's been put out by the Wolf Brown Group. Notice that they begin on the left with spectating, sitting in a chair watching what's going on. Then we enrich engagement a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about the music, the composer, and so on and so forth. Then they move to crowdsourcing. The audience becomes activated in choosing or contributing towards an artistic product. Co-creation. Audience members contribute something to an artistic experience curated by a professional artist. I loved the performance last night, but I wanted them to go the next step. How could they have made us co-creators in that performance? Christopher Small, the philosopher, says, when we're in a room like this and music is happening, we are all co-creators. How do we ensure that that co-creation is happening? And then the audience as artists, where audience members substantially take control of the artistic experience, and the focus shifts from the product to the process of creation. And I'll bet you if we could get to the far right end of this spectrum, our concert halls would be filled. And we could sell more tickets than we have seats. This is a model that we implemented at Georgia State University in Atlanta for preparing performing musicians and teachers as collaborators in music education. Remember my experience with the composer. The composer had no background in education. He came into the school not understanding really what his role as a composer could possibly be there. We cannot expect this to happen just out of goodwill. It happens through preparation, and it happens through rigorous preparation. And it happens by making sure that people like me who run a school of music are bringing the music education majors, the performance majors, the musicology majors, the theory majors, and all others together around what does it mean to be a musician in today's society, and what responsibilities do we have collaboratively around creating a sustainable culture for music in our schools and in our communities. And then it needs to continue in professional development, because as we all know, college is only the beginning. So we have to make sure that professional development occurs so that artists and teachers and arts organizations and schools can work successfully together. This happened to be the matrix that we used to show what we did. You'll see the student, the music teacher, the classroom teacher, and the performer along the bottom. On the left side, you'll see the elements of music, and at the top, you'll see the former standards that came out in 1994. What we wanted to make sure of was that we were getting intersection among all of those components of collaboration. The Carnegie Foundation says engagement describes collaboration between institutions and their communities for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. If you bring an artist into your classroom, you don't go to the back and say, now boys and girls, here's the really important person. What's really important is that the teacher and the artist are collaborating. I've witnessed many, many of these programs. I saw a great example in visual art of a clay artist in a classroom. The teacher was going around saying, well, feel the clay, touch it, stretch it, roll it. The artist was going around saying, here, let me show you how to do that. Boom, a finished product. It's not because the artist wasn't a wonderful artist, it's because the artist didn't have that educational expertise. A few programs I'd urge you to take a look at. Musical Futures in the UK. These are programs that are organic. They've come out of the nature of music itself and people's relationships with music. They are not imposed programs. They are programs that grow organically and authentically out of given situations. Musical Futures is based on the research of Lucy Green and involves all kids in small groups improvising and composing. Connect is at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. It's a program that engages with immigrant populations in East London and brings them to the Guildhall for a culminating performance. The Sage Gateshead, and by the way, I'll make this PowerPoint available, so you don't need to try to write it all down. I'll see that Michael can distribute it to you. The Sage Gateshead in Newcastle in the UK, a performing arts center that was specifically designed as an education center. It is a performing arts center, but it was designed as an education center. And the Band Quest, Choral Quest program of the American Composers Forum, if you don't happen to know about that program already. I won't go over this right now, but this slide is about what can I do? What can you do as an individual? Because one of the questions that always comes up is, look, buddy, I'm one person in a school, working from morning till night. Now you're telling me I should go out and find all these people in the community to connect with and figure out how to get along with artists who I don't really get along with anyway, and, you know, get a life, okay? So I've been there. Yes, it's labor intensive, but boy, does it enrich teaching and learning in the classroom and make going to work a lot more fun. It takes a village. Failure may not be fatal, but failure to change may be. Coalitions and cooperation are great. Oh, let's bus 500 kids down to Symphony Hall. That'll be a great experience. That's not collaboration. Collaborations are essential. Potential partners are many. We haven't talked about all the range of potential partnerships. The challenge is making sure they fulfill a holistic, research-based vision of music and arts learning. Charles Darwin said that in the history of humankind, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. And I'd like to close with this. In all the rhetoric about school reform and measuring and analyzing and assessing, don't forget what we're really all about. Give your kids the experience of beauty. Teach them to feel. Know that the work that you're doing is important and lasting work. And thanks very much for listening. Appreciate it.